Continuing Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. He was called the Great Lawyer, an earned title. He and Driscoll were the same age, a year or two past 60. Although Driscoll was a free thinker and Howard a strong and determined Presbyterian, their warm intimacy suffered no impairment in consequence. They were men whose opinions were their own property and not subject to revision and amendment, suggestion or criticism by anybody, even their friends. The day's fishing finished, they came floating down stream in their skiff, talking national politics and other high matters, and presently met a skiff coming up from town with a man in it who said, "I reckon you know, one of the new twins gave your nephew a kicking last night, Judge." "Did what?" "Gave him a kicking." The old Judge's lips paled, and his eyes began to flame. He choked with anger for a moment, and then got out what he was trying to say. Well, go on. Give me the details." The man did it. At the finish, the Judge was silent a minute, turning over in his mind the shameful picture of Tom's flight over the footlights. Then he said, as if musing aloud, "Him? I don't understand it. I was asleep at home. He didn't wake me. Thought he was competent to manage his affair without my help, I reckon." His face lit up with pride and pleasure at that thought, and he said with a cheery complacency, "I like it. It's the true old blood. Hey, Pembroke." Howard smiled, an iron smile, and nodded his head approvingly. Then the newsbringer spoke again. The Tom beat the twin on the trial. The Judge looked at the man wonderingly and said, "The trial? What trial?" "Why, Tom had him up before Judge Robinson for assault and battery." The old man shrank suddenly together like one who'd been received of a death stroke. Howard sprang for him as he sank forward in a swoon and took him in his arms and bedded him on his back in the boat. He sprinkled water in his face and said to the startled visitor, "Go now. Don't let him come and find you here. You see what an effect on your heedless speech has had. You ought to have been more considerate than to blurt out such a cruel piece of slander as that." "I'm right down sorry I did it now, Mr. Howard, and I wouldn't have done it if I had thought, but it ain't slander. It's perfectly true, just as I told him." He rode away. Presently, the old Judge came out of his faint and looked up piteously into the sympathetic face that was bent over him. "Say it ain't true, Pembroke. Tell me it ain't true," he said in a weak voice. There was nothing weak in the deep organ tones that responded, "You know it's a lie as well as I do, old friend. He is of the best blood of the Old Dominion." "God bless you for saying it," the old gentleman said fervently. "Ah, Pembroke, it was such a blow." And, well, Tom was always picking fights, so it's not that you just people don't like you or don't like what you have to say or something like that that ever justifies a violent response, but it's having the slave fight for him and stuff like this kind of is going to come back around eventually, right? Howard stayed by his friend and saw him home and entered his house with him. It was dark and past supper time, but the Judge was not thinking of supper. He was eager to hear the slander refuted from headquarters, and as eager to have Howard hear it too. Tom was sent for, and he came immediately. Yeah, don't just accuse people of slander. Say, I don't know, doesn't seem like it or whatever, but I'm going to have to check him out, right? Tom was sent for, and he came immediately. He was bruised and lame, and was not a happy-looking object. His uncle made him sit down and said, "We have been hearing about your adventure, Tom, with a handsome lie added to it for embellishment. Now pulverize that lie to dust. What measures have you taken? How does the thing stand?" Tom answered guilelessly, "It don't stand at all. It's all over. I had him up in court and beat him. Pudd'nhead Wilson defended him, the first case he ever had, and lost it. The court fined the miserable hound $5 for the assault. What was that? Was that like a month's pay or something? Howard and the judge sprang to their feet with the opening sentence. Why, neither knew. Then they stood gazing vacantly at each other. Howard stood a moment, and mournfully down, sitting without saying anything. The judge's wrath began to kindle, and he burst out, You cur, you scum, you vermin, do you mean to tell me that the blood of my race has suffered a blow and crawled to a court of law about it? Answer me. Tom's head dropped, and he answered with an eloquent silence. His uncle stared at him with mixed expression of amazement and shame and incredulity. That was sorrowful to see. At last he said, Which of the twins was it? Count Luigi. You have challenged him? No, hesitated Tom, turning pale. You will challenge him tonight. Howard will carry it. Tom began to turn sick, and to show it, he turned his hat around and round in his hand, his uncle glowering blacker and blacker upon him as the heavy seconds drifted by. Then, at last, he began to stammer and said piteously, Oh, please, don't ask me to do it, uncle. He's a murderous devil. I never could. I'm afraid of him. Old Driscoll's mouth opened and closed 3 times before he could get it to perform its office. Then he stormed out. A coward of my family? A Driscoll a coward? Oh, what have I done to deserve this infamy? He tottered to his secretary in the corner, repeating that lament, and again in heartbreaking tones, and got it out of a drawer a paper, which he slowly tore to bits, scattering the bits absently in his track. As he walked up and down the room, still grieving and lamenting, at last he said, There it is, shreds and fragments, once more, my will. Once more you have forced me to disinherit you, you base son of a most noble father. Leave my sight. Go before I spit on you. What, for being law-abiding? It's messed up in the head. The young man did not tarry. Then the judge turned to Howard. You will be my second, old friend. Of course. There is pen and paper. Draft the cartel, and lose no time. The count shall have in its hands in 15 minutes. He shall have it in his hands in 15 minutes, said Howard. Tom was very heavy-hearted. His appetite was gone with his property and his self-respect, and he went out the back way and wandered down the obscure lane, grieving and wondering if any course of future conduct, however discreet and carefully perfected and watched over, could win back his uncle's favor and persuade him to reconstruct once more that generous will which had just gone to ruin before his eyes. He finally concluded that it could. He said to himself that he had accomplished this sort of triumph once already, and that what had been done once could be done again. He would set about it. He would bend every energy to the task, and would score that triumph once more, cost what it might to his convenience. Limit as it might his frivolous and liberty-loving life. Those are dear, by the way. To begin, he said to himself, I'll square up with the proceeds of my raid, and then gambling has got to be stopped, and stopped short off. It's the worst vice I've got, from my standpoint anyway, because it's the one he can most easily find out. Through the impatience of my creditors, he thought it expensive to have to pay $200 to them for me once. Expensive that. Why, it cost me the whole of his fortune. But, of course, he never thought of that. Some people can't think of any but their own side of a case. If he had known how deep I am in, now the will would have gone to pot without waiting for a duel to help. $300. It's a pile, but they'll never hear of it, I'm thankful to say. The minute I've cleared it off, I'm safe, and I'll never touch a card again. Anyway, I won't while he lives. I make oath to that. I'm entering on my last reform. I know it, yes, and I'll win. But after that, if I ever slip up again, I'm gone. Well, if you cover mistakes with mistakes and mistakes, and that usually doesn't work out for you. Chapter 13, Tom stares at ruin. When I reflect upon the number of disagreeable people who I know to have gone to a better world, I am moved to lead a different life. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. October. This is one of the peculiarly dangerous months to speculate in stocks in. The others are July, January, September, April, November, May, March, June, December, August, and February. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. Thus mournfully communing with himself, Tom moped along the lane past Pudd'nhead Wilson's house and still on and between fences, enclosing vacant country on each hand till he neared the haunted house, and he came moping back again with many sighs and heavy with trouble. He sorely wanted cheerful company. Rowena. His heart gave a bound at the thought. But the next thought quieted it. The detested twins would be there. He was on the inhabited side of Wilson's house, and now as he approached it, he noticed that the sitting room was lighted. This would do. Others made him feel unwelcome sometimes, but Wilson never failed in courtesy towards him, and a kindly courtesy does at least save one's feelings, even if it is not professing to stand for a welcome. Wilson heard footsteps at his threshold, then the clearing of a throat. It's that fickle-tempered, dissipated young goose, poor devil. He finds friends pretty scarce today, likely after the disgrace of carrying a personal assault case into a law court. A dejected knock. Come in. Tom entered and drooped into a chair without saying anything. Wilson said kindly, "Why, my boy, you look desolate. Don't take it so hard. Try and forget. You have been kicked." "Oh dear," said Tom wretchedly. "It's not that, Pudd'nhead. It's not that. It's 1,000 times worse than that. Oh yes, 1,000,000 times worse. Why, Tom, what do you mean? Has Rowena flung me? No, but the old man has." Wilson said to himself, "Aha!" and the thought of a mysterious girl in the bedroom. The Driscolls have been making discoveries. Then he said aloud gravely, "Tom, there are some kinds of dissipation which—" "Oh shucks, this hasn't got anything to do with dissipation. He wanted me to challenge that derned Italian savage, and I wouldn't do it." "Yes, of course he would do that," said Wilson in a meditative matter-of-course way. "But the thing that puzzled me was why he didn't look to that last night, for one thing, and why he let you carry such a matter into a court of law at all, either before the duel or after it. It's no place for it. It was not like him. I couldn't understand it. How did it happen? It happened because he didn't know anything about it. He was asleep when I got home last night, and you didn't wake him? Tom, is that possible?" Tom was not getting much comfort here. He fidgeted a moment and then said, "I didn't choose to tell him, that's all. He was going a-fishing before dawn with Pembroke Howard, and if I got the twins into the common caboose, and I thought sure I could, I never dreamed of their slipping out on a paltry fine for such an outrageous offense. Well, once in the caboose, they would be disgraced, and Uncle wouldn't want any duels with that sort of characters, and wouldn't allow any. Tom, I am ashamed of you. I don't see how you could treat your good old uncle so. I'm a better friend of his than you are. For if I had known the circumstances, I would have kept that case out of court until I got word to him, and let him have a gentleman's chance." The idea that you feel disrespected or something, you pull a gun on someone, even if it's like ordered and they get the chance to, this, how is that the more civilized way? And why are there so many things about being civilized that seem just worse, right? "You would," exclaimed Tom with a lively surprise, "and your first case. And you know perfectly well there never would have been any case if he had got that chance, don't you? And you'd have finished your days a pauper, nobody. Instead of being an actually launched and recognized lawyer today, And you would really have done that, would you? Certainly. Tom looked at him a moment or two, and then shook his head sorrowfully and said, I believe you upon my word, I do. I don't know why I do, but I do. Pudd'nhead Wilson, I think you're the biggest fool I ever saw. Thank you. Don't mention it. Well, it has been requiring you to fight the Italian, and you have refused. You degenerate remnant of an honorable line. I'm thoroughly ashamed of you, Tom. Oh, that's nothing. I don't care for anything now that the will's torn up again. Tom, tell me squarely. Didn't he find any fault with you for anything but those two things? Carrying the case into court and refusing to fight? He watched the young fellow's face narrowly, but it was entirely reposeful, and so also was the voice that answered. No, he didn't find any other fault with me. If he had any to find, he would have begun yesterday, for he was just in the humor of it. He drove that Jack pair around town and showed them sights. And when he came home, he couldn't find his father's old silver watch that don't keep time, and he thinks much of it, and couldn't remember what he did with it 3 or 4 days ago, when he saw it last. And so, when I arrived, he was all in a sweat about it, and when I suggested that it probably wasn't lost but stolen, it put him in a regular passion, and he said I was a fool, which convinced me, without any trouble, and that was just what he was afraid of had happened himself, but did not want to believe it, because lost things stand a better chance of being found again than stolen ones. Whew, whistled Wilson. Score another on the list. Another what? Another theft. Theft? Yes, theft. That watch isn't lost, it's stolen. There's been another raid on the town, and just the same old mysterious sort of thing that has happened once before, as you remember. You don't mean it. It's as sure as you were born. Have you missed anything yourself? No, that is, I did miss the silver pencil case that Aunt Mary Pratt gave me last birthday. You'll find it stolen, that's what you'll find. No, I shan't, for when I suggested theft about the watch and got such a rap, I went and examined my room, and the pencil case was missing, but it was only mislaid, and I found it again. You were sure you missed nothing else? Well, nothing in consequence. I missed a small, plain gold ring worth $2 or $3. A gold ring, huh? Okay, but that will turn up. I'll look again. In my opinion, you'll not find it. There's been a raid, I tell you. Come in. Mr. Justice Robinson entered, followed by Buckstone and the town constable, Jim Blake. They sat down, and after some wandering and aimless weather conversation, Wilson said, By the way, we've just added another to the list of thieves, the list of thefts, maybe 2. Judge Driscoll's old silver watch is gone, and Tom here has missed a gold ring. Well, it is a bad business, said the justice, and it gets worse the further it goes. The Hankseys, the Dobsons, the Pilligrews, the Ortons, the Grangers, the Hales, the Fullers, the Holcombs, in fact, everybody that lives around about Patsy Cooper's has been robbed of little things like trinkets and teaspoons and such like small valuables that are easily carried off. It's perfectly plain that the thief took advantage of the reception at Patsy Cooper's when all the neighbors were in her house, and all their Negroes hanging around her fence for a look at the show, to raid the vacant houses undisturbed. Patsy is miserable about it, miserable on account of the neighbors, and particularly miserable on account of her foreigners, of course. So miserable on their account that she hasn't any room to worry about her own little losses. It's the same old raider, said Wilson. I suppose there isn't any doubt about that. Constable Blake doesn't think so. No, you're wrong there, said Blake. The other times it was a man. There was plenty of signs of that, as we know, in the profession, though we never got hands on him. But this time, it's a woman. Wilson thought of the mysterious girl straight off. She was always in his mind now. But she failed him again, Blake continued. She's a stoop-shouldered old woman with a covered basket on her arm, in a black veil, dressed in mourning. I saw her going aboard the ferry boat yesterday. Lives in Illinois, I reckon. But I don't care where she lives. I'm going to get her. She can make herself sure of that. What makes you think she's the thief? Well, there ain't any other, for one thing. And for another, some of the Negro draymen that happened to be driving along saw her coming out or going into houses, and told me so. And it just happens that they was robbed houses every time. It was granted that this was plenty good enough circumstantial evidence. A pensive silence followed, which lasted some moments. Then Wilson said, "There's one good thing anyway. She can't either pawn or sell Count Luigi's costly Indian dagger." "My," said Tom. "Is that gone?" "Yes." "Well, that was a haul. But why can't she pawn it or sell it?" "Because when the twins went home from the Sons of Liberty meeting last night, news of the raid was sifting in from everywhere, and Aunt Patsy was in distress to know if they had lost anything. They found that the dagger was gone, and they notified the police and pawnbrokers everywhere. It was a great haul, yes, but the old woman won't get anything out of it because she'll get caught." "Did they offer a reward?" asked Buckstone. "Yes, $500 for the knife, and $500 for the thief." "What a leather-headed idea!" exclaimed the constable. "The thief doesn't go near them, nor send anybody. Whoever goes is going to get himself nabbed, for there ain't any pawnbroker that's going to lose the chance to." If anybody had noticed Tom's face at that time, the gray-green color of it might have provoked curiosity, but nobody did. He said to himself, "I'm gone. I never can square up. The rest of the plunder won't pawn or sell for half the bill. Oh, I know it. I'm gone, and this time it's for good. Oh, this is awful. I don't know what to do, nor which way to turn." "Softly, softly," said Wilson to Blake. "I planned their scheme for them at midnight last night. It was all finished up, ship-shape, by 2 this morning. They'll get their dagger back, and then I'll explain to you how the thing was done." There were strong signs of a general curiosity, and Buckstone said, "Well, you have whetted us up pretty sharp, Wilson, and I'm free to say that if you don't mind telling us in confidence—" "Oh, I'd as soon tell as not, Buckstone, but as long as the twins and I agreed to say nothing about it, we must let it stand so. But you can keep my word for it. You won't be waiting for 3 days. Somebody will apply for that reward pretty promptly, and I'll show you the thief and the dagger both very soon afterward." The constable was disappointed and also perplexed. He said, "It may all be yes, and I hope it will, but I'm blamed if I can see my way through it. It's too many for yours truly." The subject seemed about talked out. Nobody seemed to have anything further to offer. After a silence, the justice of the peace informed Wilson that he and Buckstone and the constable had come as a committee on the part of the Democratic Party to ask him to run for mayor, for the little town was about to become a city, and the first charter election was approaching. It was the first attention which Wilson ever received at the hands of any party. It was a sufficiently humble one, but it was a recognition of his debut into the town's life and activities at last. It was a step upward, and he was deeply gratified. He accepted, and the committee departed, followed by young Tom. Chapter 14. Roxana insists upon reform. The true Southern watermelon is a boon apart and not to be mentioned with commoner things. It is chief of this world's luxuries, king, by the grace of God, over all the fruits of the earth. When one has tasted it, he knows what the angels eat. It was not a southern watermelon that Eve took. We know it, because she repented. Put it in Wilson's calendar. And melons actually come from different parts of the world, but some things were brought from Africa, seeds that the slaves carried. But there's evidence of watermelons before the colonial powers brought slaves over. So, about the time that Wilson was bowing the committee out, Pembroke Howard was entering the last house to report. He found the old judge sitting grim and straight in his chair, waiting. "Well, Howard, the news? The best in the world. Accepts, does he?" And the light of the battle gleamed joyously in the judge's eye. "Accepts? Why, he jumped at it." Did he? Now that's fine. That's very fine. I like that. When is it to be? Now, straight off, tonight. Admirable fellow, admirable. Admirable, he's a darling. Why, it's an honor as well as a pleasure to stand up before such a man. Come off with you. Go and arrange everything and give him my heartiest compliments. A rare fellow indeed, an admirable fellow, as you have said. Howard hurried away, saying, "I'll have him in the vacant stretch between Wilson's and the haunted house within the hour, and I'll bring my own pistols." Judge Driscoll began to walk the floor in a state of pleased excitement, but presently he stopped and began to think of Tom. Twice he moved toward the secretary, and twice he turned away again, but finally he said, "This may be my last night in the world. I must not take the chance. He is worthless and unworthy, but it is largely my fault. He was entrusted to me by my brother on his dying bed, and I have indulged him to his hurt. Instead of training him up severely and making a man out of him, I have violated my trust, and I must not add to the sin of desertion to that. I have forgiven him once already, and would subject him to a long and hard trial before forgiving him again, if I could live. But I must not run that risk. No, I must restore the will. But if I survive the duel, I will hide it away, and he will not know, and I will not tell him until he reforms. And I see that his reformation is going to be permanent." He redrew the will, and his ostensible nephew was heir to a fortune again, and he was finishing his task. Tom, wearied with another brooding tramp, entered the house and went tiptoeing past the sitting-room door. He glanced in and hurried on, for the sight of his uncle had nothing but terrors for him tonight. But his uncle was writing. Yeah, and that back in the day, and still to this day in some societies, even in America, you can't be alone with a woman. Well, the woman outside the family, But yeah, it's either your wife or somebody you can't marry. That's who you're alone with. And I guess, the doctor too, right? The door tiptoeing past the door. He glanced in and hurried on, for the sight of his, because people are going to assume things. But just because you were alone with somebody doesn't mean that you've, But his uncle was writing. That was unusual at this late hour. What could he be writing? A chill of anxiety settled down upon Tom's heart. Did the writing concern him? He was afraid so. He reflected that when ill luck begins, it does not come in sprinkles, but in showers. He said he would get a glimpse of that document, or know the reason why. He heard someone coming and stepped out of sight and hearing. It was Pembroke Howard. What could be hatching? Howard said, with great satisfaction, "Everything's right and ready. He's gone to the battleground with his second and the surgeon, also with his brother. I've arranged it all with Wilson. Wilson's his second. We are to have 3 shots apiece." "Good. How is the moon?" "Bright as day, nearly. Perfect for the distance, 15 yards, no wind, out of breath, hot and still. All good. All first rate. Here, Pembroke, read this, and witness it." Pembroke read and witnessed the will, and gave the old man's hand a hearty shake, and said, "Now, that's right, York. But I knew you would do it. You couldn't leave that poor chap to fight along without means or profession, with certain defeat before him. And I knew you wouldn't, for his father's sake, if not for his own. For his dead father's sake, I couldn't. I know, for a poor Percy. But you know what Percy was to me. But mind, Tom is not to know of this unless I fall tonight. I understand. I'll keep the secret." The judge was to put the will away, and the two started for the battleground. In another minute, the will was in Tom's hands. His misery vanished. His feelings underwent a tremendous revulsion. He put the will carefully back in its place and spread his mouth and swung his hat once, twice, thrice times around his head in imitation of the three rousing huzzas. No sound issuing from his lips, he fell to communing with himself excitedly and joyously, but every now and then he let off another volley of dumb hurrahs. He said to himself, "I've got the fortune again, but I'll not let on that I know about it, and this time I'm going to hang on to it. I take no more risks. I'll gamble no more. I'll drink no more because I'll not go where there is any of that sort of thing going on again." One of the poisons of the heart is the company, right? It's the sure way, and the only sure way. I might have thought of that sooner. Well, yes, if I had wanted to, but now, dear me, I've had a scare this time, and I'll take no more chances. Not a single chance more. Land. I persuaded myself this evening that I could fetch him around without any great amount of effort, but I've been getting more and more heavy-hearted and doubtful straight along ever since. If he tells me about this thing, all right, but if he doesn't, I shan't let on. I'd like to tell Pudd'nhead Wilson, but no, I'll think about that. Perhaps I won't. He whirled off another dead huzzah and said, "I'm informed, and this time I'll stay so sure." He was about to close with the final grand silent demonstration when he suddenly recollected that Wilson had put it out of his power to pawn or sell the Indian knife, and that he was once more in awful peril of exposure by his creditors for that reason. His joy collapsed utterly, and he turned away and moped toward the door, moaning and lamenting over the bitterness of his luck. He dragged himself upstairs and brooded in his room a long time, disconsolate and forlorn, with Luigi's Indian knife for text. At last he sighed and said, "When I suppose these stones were glass and this ivory bone, the thing hadn't any interest for me because it hadn't any value and couldn't help me out of my trouble. But now, why, now it is full of interest, yes, and of a sort to break a body's heart. It's a bag of gold that has turned to dirt and ashes in my hands. It could save me, and save me so easily, and yet I've got to go to ruin. It's like a drowning with a life-preserver in my reach. All the hard luck comes to me, and all the good luck goes to other people. Pudd'nhead Wilson, for instance, even his career has got a sort of little start at last. And what has he done to deserve it? I should like to know. Yes, he has opened his own road, but he isn't content with that, but must block mine. It's a sordid, selfish world, and I wish I was out of it." He allowed the light of the candle to play upon the jewels of the sheath, but the flashings and the sparklings had no charm for his eye. They were only just so many pangs to his heart. And